Security, remove this embarrassment from my gala immediately, my stepmother Vivian hissed, snapping her perfectly manicured fingers in my face. Her emerald gown glittered under the grand chandeliers, but her eyes were filled with absolute venom. You are cheapening the brand just by breathing the same air as our investors. I did not scream, I did not throw my drink, I simply smiled, a slow calculated smirk that confused her, and I walked out of the ballroom. What Vivian and my arrogant father did not realize was that the very hotel they were standing in belonged entirely to me. And before midnight, I would freeze their offshore accounts, seize their assets, and watch them beg on their knees for a mercy I did not possess. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled their fake billionaire empire piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. If you have ever had to remind a toxic family that silence is not weakness, it is simply the sound of a trap being set. The Grand Sovereign Hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago was an absolute masterpiece of high society excess. The air was thick with the scent of imported white roses and the heavy, expensive musk of desperation, masquerading as generational wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a sea of tailored tuxedos and custom silk gowns. A live jazz quartet played smoothly in the corner, setting the perfect rhythm for a room completely filled with fake smiles, calculated handshakes, and hollow promises. I stood near a massive ice sculpture at the far edge of the room, sipping a glass of sparkling water, simply observing the performance. At 32 years old, I had mastered the delicate art of being entirely invisible around my own bloodline. I was wearing a simple, tailored charcoal blazer and a minimalist black dress, perfectly playing the role they had aggressively assigned to me years ago. The struggling, mediocre freelance consultant who was barely scraping by. They needed me to be the ultimate disappointment, so their fabricated success could shine brighter. I watched my father Richard, holding court near the center of the room. His booming laugh echoed off the marble pillars as he aggressively shook hands with local politicians and real estate tycoons. He looked the part of the highly successful patriarch, but I knew the absolute truth behind that $1,000 suit. He was drowning. Then there was Vivian, my stepmother. She was 58 but fought violently against time, draped in an emerald green gown that was far too tight, and a diamond necklace that caught the light with every dramatic, arrogant movement she made. She thrived in these environments, aggressively feeding off the attention and the perceived power of being the elite hostess of a highly exclusive charity gala. I watched her glide from table to table, kissing cheeks and accepting empty compliments that she absorbed like oxygen. I had not come tonight to cause a scene, I had come because, despite 17 years of emotional neglect, some lingering, naive part of my inner child thought that showing up to support my father's supposed philanthropic efforts was the right thing to do. I stayed near the perimeter, entirely avoiding the event photographer and keeping entirely to myself. But in a room where every single detail was meticulously curated by Vivian to project absolute perfection, my quiet presence was apparently a catastrophic flaw she could not tolerate. I saw the exact moment her eyes locked onto me. The performative, glowing smile vanished from her face instantly, replaced by a deep, visceral sneer that I had been on the receiving end of since I was a teenager. She aggressively whispered something to a passing staff member, her manicured hand gripping her champagne flute so tightly, her knuckles turned bone white. Within seconds, the entire atmosphere shifted. The smooth jazz seemed to fade into the background as Vivian marched aggressively toward me, her heels clicking violently against the polished marble floor. She did not come alone. Flanking her on either side were two massive, imposing security guards, their expressions serious and unyielding. I did not move. I held my glass of water, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely neutral. Vivian stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. She did not bother to lower her voice. In fact, she seemed to project it directly into the crowd, desperately wanting an audience for my humiliation. What exactly do you think you are doing here, Elena? Vivian demanded, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a sharpened blade. The conversations at the neighboring tables sputtered and died. Heads turned, eyes widened. I bought a ticket, Vivian, I replied, my voice dangerously soft and perfectly level. It is a charity gala. I came to support the foundation. She let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly. Support the foundation? With what? The spare change from your little freelancing gigs? She took a step closer, her tone dripping with venom and mock pity. This is a $10,000 a plate charity gala, Elena. This is not a soup kitchen for you to network at. We absolutely cannot have you handing out your cheap business cards and harassing our elite guests. You do not belong here. Leave immediately before I have you physically removed. Before the guards could even reach for my arm, Julian stepped aggressively into my personal space. My stepbrother was a toxic finance bro with a massive superiority complex, dressed in a velvet tuxedo that likely cost more than he actually held in his checking account. He swirled his expensive scotch, chuckling arrogantly as he looked down at me. Come on, Elena, Julian said, patronizing me with a wide, fake smile. My hedge fund investors are sitting at the next table over. We are actively trying to secure major funding tonight, and we really cannot have you cheapening the brand. It is just an incredibly bad look for the family. Chloe, my 26-year-old stepsister, materialized right beside him. She dramatically adjusted the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. You are always embarrassing us, Elena, she muttered, rolling her eyes aggressively. Just go back to your little apartment and your boring life. You are literally ruining my night just by standing here. Vivian crossed her arms, eagerly seizing the opportunity to twist the knife deeper. You made your absolute choice when you moved out at 18 to hustle in the mud, she sneered, her voice carrying over the music so the surrounding socialites could hear every single word. You could have worked as an assistant at your father's firm, but you wanted to be independent. Well, look exactly where that got you, still begging for scraps at a table you cannot even afford to sit at. Now get out. I looked at the three of them, Vivian with her absolute venom, Chloe with her toxic entitlement, Julian's with his massive arrogance, and then I looked past them. Standing less than 20 feet away was my father, Richard. He had made direct eye contact with me. He saw the security guards actively closing in on my arms. He heard every single word Vivian had screamed at me. And then, he simply turned his back, taking a slow sip of his bourbon, and actively returning to his conversation with a real estate developer. That was it, the final absolute confirmation of exactly where I stood. They were actively trying to shrink me. They heavily expected tears, a massive public meltdown, or a desperate plea for my father to intervene. But I did not shrink. I did not cry. I looked directly at the two massive security guards who were hovering inches away from my shoulders. Do not touch me, I said, my voice radiating a cold, surgical fury. I know the exact way out of my own family's event. I did not look back at Vivian. I did not spare another glance for Julian or Chloe. I simply smiled, a slow, terrifying smirk that made Vivian instinctively take a step back. And I turned on my heel. I walked confidently toward the grand exit, my head held incredibly high, my posture utterly unbroken. Every single step I took away from that ballroom was a step closer to their absolute ruin. The grand ballroom of the Sovereign Hotel felt miles away the absolute moment the heavy brass doors closed behind me, instantly muting the jazz band and the obnoxious clinking of crystal glasses. The grand foyer of the hotel was a stark contrast, vast and echoey, lined with imported marble columns and heavy gold leaf accents. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone. I was halfway to the valet stand when I heard heavy, urgent footsteps rushing aggressively up from behind. Elena, wait a minute. I stopped, but I did not turn around immediately. I recognized that voice instantly. It was the same voice that had read me bedtime stories when I was a child. The exact same voice that had slowly grown cold and distant the moment Vivian aggressively inserted herself into our lives. It was my father, Richard. I turned slowly to face him. He looked heavily out of breath, his tailored tuxedo pulling slightly at the seams. For a split second, a foolish, persistent part of my inner child desperately hoped he had chased after me to apologize, to defend me, to finally act like a father. That delusion vanished completely the exact moment he opened his mouth. "You know exactly how Vivian gets about the aesthetic of these events," Richard said, letting out an exasperated sigh as he ran a heavy hand over his graying hair. "She has been under a massive amount of stress putting this gala together. You showing up unannounced in that plain dress just completely threw her off balance. Just go home, Elena. Do not actively make this a bigger deal than it needs to be." I stared at him. He was not here to protect me. He was here to aggressively manage a public relations issue. "I did not show up unannounced, Richard," I replied, my voice dangerously soft. I had stopped calling him Dad a very long time ago. "I purchased a premium ticket through the charity website." I was perfectly quiet, until your wife actively decided to use me as a prop to inflate her massive superiority complex. "Do not talk about Vivian that way," he snapped aggressively, taking a step forward. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek silver money clip. He peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills and held them out toward me. "Take this, get yourself a nice dinner somewhere else. I will actively wire you a few $100 tomorrow to cover whatever minor expenses you have this week. Just do not ruin Chloe's networking night with Julian's Wall Street friends. They are incredibly important people." I looked at the crumpled bills in his outstretched hand. The sheer massive disrespect of it almost made me laugh out loud. He was actively trying to pay me off, treating me like a toxic nuisance begging for a handout, completely and utterly blind to the absolute reality of who I actually was. "Keep your money," I said, swatting his hand away gently. "I do not need your charity, always so incredibly stubborn and proud," Richard groaned, shaking his head. "This is exactly why you heavily struggle, Elena. You always have to make things difficult. If you would just apologize to Vivian and actively play along, your life would be so much easier." Play along. The heat in my chest flared violently, but I kept my face utterly composed. "You mean, like how you actively played along, when Vivian completely drained my entire college fund just weeks before my freshman year?" Richard flinched. He absolutely hated when I brought up the past. "I was 18 years old," I continued, actively closing the distance between us, forcing him to look me directly in the eye. "I worked 3 jobs in high school just to afford textbooks, while you actively let Vivian take the money my biological mother left for my education. You gave my entire college fund to Chloe, so she could drive a brand new sports car to her private university. You threw me out into the street with absolutely nothing, telling me it builds character to hustle in the mud." "Elena, that was years ago. Stop living in the past," he hissed aggressively, glancing around the empty foyer to ensure no hotel staff were actively listening to his massive failures. Vivian needed to ensure Chloe had the right image for her social circles. "You were always highly resilient. I completely knew you would figure it out. And look at you. You are doing perfectly fine planning your little freelance projects. But tonight is about high-level business. You do not deeply understand how these things work." "You are absolutely right," I replied smoothly. "I do not deeply understand how a man can stand by and watch his own flesh and blood be humiliated by a woman who married him solely for his bank account. A bank account that, by the way, has been completely running on fumes for years." Richard's eyes widened massively. A flash of genuine, deep panic crossed his features before he aggressively masked it with arrogant bluster. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Go home, Elena. Do not come back to our house until you are perfectly ready to show some strict respect." He turned his back on me for the second time that night and walked aggressively back toward the ballroom doors, completely retreating into his fragile bubble of fake wealth and borrowed prestige. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt absolutely nothing. The last frayed string attaching me to my father snapped completely, and with it went any hesitation I had about absolutely destroying his world. the crisp Chicago night air, hit my face the second I stepped through the revolving glass doors of the Sovereign Hotel. It was refreshing, sharp, and biting. It was a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of fake wealth and cheap perfume I had just left behind in the lobby. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, letting the cool wind clear my lungs. If Vivian and Richard were peering through the tinted glass of the ballroom windows, they probably expected to see me shivering on the curb. In their narrow minds, they likely pictured me pulling up a ride-sharing app on a cracked phone screen. Or worse, walking 3 blocks, in my sensible black heels, to catch the late-night train, back to whatever cramped apartment they assumed I lived in. They needed to imagine me struggling. It was the only way they could validate their own hollow existence. But I was not struggling. I had not struggled in a very long time. I walked past the long line of guests, waiting for their luxury sedans and rented sports cars. The valet stand was a chaotic swarm of shouting attendants and impatient socialites. I did not stop at the back of the line. I bypassed the velvet ropes and walked directly up to the head valet, a sharp-eyed young man named Marcus, who had been working at this hotel for 5 years. I did not hand him a crumpled paper ticket, I simply made eye contact and gave him a single, subtle nod. Marcus immediately stood up straighter. He tapped his earpiece, turned his back to the shouting guests, and spoke a rapid command into his radio. Less than 30 seconds later, the low, guttural purr of a massive engine vibrated through the circular driveway. It drowned out the chatter of the crowd and the distant sounds of city traffic. Gliding smoothly out of the VIP underground staging area was my vehicle. It was a custom, jet black, bulletproof Maybach. The paint was so immaculately polished, it looked like liquid obsidian under the canopy lights. The windows were tinted, so heavily they absorbed the light, hiding the passenger cabin in absolute secrecy. The crowd of Chicago elites standing at the valet stand fell entirely silent. Conversations sputtered and died. Even the most arrogant men in the crowd, the ones who had just been inside drinking Julian's expensive scotch, turned to stare at the machine, rolling to a halt right in front of me. The driver's side door opened, and David stepped out. David was not just a chauffeur. He was a former military security contractor. I paid a premium to keep me safe and insulated from the world. He wore a crisp, tailored charcoal suit, his posture rigid and professional. He walked around the front of the vehicle, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency, before he pulled open the heavy, armored rear door for me. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement near the hotel entrance. The general manager of the Sovereign, a meticulous man who obsessed over VIP clientele, had just stepped outside to assist a high-profile guest. He froze when he saw the Maybach, then his eyes shifted to the woman stepping into it. I saw the exact moment the realization hit him. The blood drained from his face, his jaw went slack. He knew who owned that specific vehicle, because he had been briefed on the security protocols for the anonymous owner of the building. He was looking at the woman who signed his paychecks, the woman who owned the very marble he was standing on. And he knew that his security team had just been ordered to throw me out. I did not give him a second glance. I did not offer him a reassuring smile or a nod of acknowledgement. I slid into the plush, temperature-controlled leather seat of the Maybach. David closed the heavy armored door behind me, and the thud sealed off the outside world completely. The transition was instantaneous. The noise of the city, the murmurs of the crowd, the lingering sting of my father's rejection, it all vanished. The cabin of the Maybach was perfectly soundproofed. It smelled of rich leather and the subtle, clean scent of the custom detailing. I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I waited for the grief to hit me. I waited for the tears that a daughter was supposed to shed when her father finally, definitively chose his toxic wife over his own flesh and blood. I waited for the heartbreak of realizing that my family was truly gone. But the tears never came, the grief did not materialize, instead a profound sense of detachment washed over me. It was surgical and cold. The struggling freelancer persona I had worn for the last 3 hours shed from my skin like a cheap coat. I was no longer Elena, the discarded daughter. I was Elena Vance, a senior forensic auditor and the sole proprietor of a multi-million-dollar real estate and hospitality empire. I had taken the sheer rage of my teenage years and forged it into a weapon. While my family spent their money on country club memberships and designer clothes, I had spent my time building capital, acquiring assets, and learning exactly how to trace money through the darkest corners of the global financial system. I opened my eyes, the cold clarity of my purpose sharpening my focus. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my encrypted phone. I dialed a highly secure number. It rang exactly once. Alina, Silas's deep, authoritative voice came through the speaker. My corporate attorney never slept, and he was the sharpest legal mind in the Midwest. "It is time," I said, leaning back against the headrest and watching the city lights blur past the tinted glass. "Execute the clauses, are you certain?" Silas asked. "Once I push this button, the entire facade comes down." "They will have nothing. They already have nothing." I corrected him. "They just do not know it yet. Richard went bankrupt 3 years ago. I am tired of letting him play pretend on my dime. It was the ultimate secret I had kept buried for 36 months. When Richard's reckless investments and Vivian's excessive spending finally caught up to them, the banks moved to foreclose on everything. To save his precious public image, Richard sought private, anonymous buyers to bail him out. He thought he was dealing with a faceless, overseas conglomerate. He never knew the conglomerate was me. I had quietly purchased Richard's debts. I bought his land through a blind trust. I even purchased the very building he was currently standing in. I was the silent owner of the Sovereign Hotel. I was their landlord, their bank, and their silent savior. And they had just ordered security to throw me out of my own property. "Understood," Silas said, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. "The trust documents are unsealed. What are your immediate directives?" "First," I instructed, my voice devoid of any warmth, "revoke the comped venue status for tonight's charity gala." They thought they were getting the ballroom for free because of their supposed elite status. "Charge them the full premium rate." Second, contact the bank. Freeze the $600 million credit line Vivian uses to fund her fake charities and designer gowns. "Cut it all off. Consider it done," Silas replied. "The hotel general manager will receive the notification in approximately 2 minutes. The credit freeze is instantaneous." "Thank you, Silas. Send the audit files to my secure server. I want to see exactly what Julian has been doing with the charity money." I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The trap was set. The guillotine was falling. Back at the Sovereign, Vivian and Julian were likely still laughing, clinking their champagne glasses, utterly oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath them had just ceased to exist. They wanted to show me that I did not fit their tax bracket. Tonight, I was going to show them they did not even belong in mine. The Maybach glided through the neon-lit streets of downtown Chicago, slipping seamlessly into the private underground parking garage of my residential building. David opened my door, and I stepped out, taking the private express elevator directly to my penthouse. When the polished steel doors parted, I stepped into my sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a stark contrast to the cramped, unheated apartment I had rented at 18 when Richard and Vivian cut me off. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, kicked off my heels, and poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet. My phone was already vibrating silently on the counter, but I ignored it. Instead, I opened my secure laptop. Silas was always punctual. A heavily encrypted file sat in my inbox, flagged with high priority. It was the forensic audit of Vivian's beloved charity, the organization she used to secure her status among Chicago's elite. I took a sip of the wine, preparing myself to sift through the vanity spending I fully expected to see. I anticipated finding $50,000 floral arrangements, lavish spa weekends disguised as wellness retreats, and private jets chartered for supposed networking events. I assumed they were simply squandering money to maintain the illusion of their wealth. But as I opened the ledgers and began scrolling through the line items, the air in the room seemed to grow cold. This was not vanity spending. This was a massive, highly coordinated criminal black hole. The numbers staring back at me were staggering. Millions of dollars in supposed charitable donations had been diverted over the past 3 years. As a forensic auditor, I could read financial statements like a second language. I cross-referenced the vendor payment logs. The funds were not going to the community outreach programs, the local orphanages, or the women's shelters Vivian loved to boast about in her magazine interviews. Instead, massive wire transfers were being systematically funneled into consulting fees for a firm called Vanguard Holdings. I opened a new tab and dug into Vanguard Holdings. It did not take long for my algorithms to trace the corporate registration back to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I kept pulling the digital thread, following the money trail, through layers of corporate obfuscation, until the final signature footprint emerged on the offshore accounts. Julian, my arrogant finance stepbrother, had not been networking at the gala tonight. He had no real hedge fund investors. The entire persona he projected was a complete fabrication. Julian was bleeding the charity dry. He was completely underwater, drowning in catastrophic Wall Street losses and leveraging his stepfather's fake charity to cover his tracks. He had been moving millions offshore, just to keep his creditors from breaking his kneecaps. And Vivian was authorizing every single one of those massive wire transfers. I stared at her digital signatures on the approval forms. Why would a woman so obsessed with her own wealth actively participate in draining it? The answer was painfully obvious. Vivian was desperate to keep up the facade. She needed the world to believe that her golden child, Julian, was a financial genius. She was willing to commit federal wire fraud just to ensure her son could keep driving imported sports cars and wearing Rolex watches. They were all in on it, a fragile house of cards built on stolen money and fragile egos. I took another sip of wine, my mind processing the sheer audacity of their scheme. But the real gut punch, the ultimate betrayal that made the breath catch in my throat, was waiting on the final page of the audit file. I opened the federal tax filings and liability documents for the charity. My eyes scanned the forms, moving past the fabricated expense reports and the falsified revenue projections. Then, at the bottom of the corporate liability declaration, I saw it. A signature, my signature. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. There it was, forged with meticulous precision. The documents legally listed Elena Vance as the Chief Operations Officer and Lead Financial Director of the Foundation. The entire paper trail had been carefully, deliberately designed to bypass Richard and Vivian entirely. If the Internal Revenue Service or the Federal Bureau of Investigation ever audited the charity, all roads, all the missing millions, and all the offshore wire transfers led directly to me. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Throwing me out of the gala tonight had absolutely nothing to do with me wearing a simple black dress or being an embarrassment to Julian's imaginary investors. They threw me out because they needed me kept at arm's length. They needed me to look like the struggling, desperate outsider who would be perfectly positioned as their designated scapegoat. They were setting me up to be the legal fall guy when the federal agents eventually came knocking. They were not just fine with humiliating me in public. They were perfectly fine with sending me to federal prison so Julian could keep his lifestyle. I pushed the laptop away, the screen illuminating my face in the dim light of the penthouse. I did not cry. I did not scream the lingering trace of sadness I had felt in the hotel foyer. That tiny pathetic hope that my father might actually love me evaporated completely. It was replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute clarity. Earlier tonight, I was just going to ruin them financially. I was going to let them face the embarrassment of bankruptcy and eviction. But now I was going to let them burn. I picked up my phone. It was already flooded with missed calls and frantic text messages. The hotel manager had clearly delivered the bill. The $600 million credit line had been frozen. The panic was setting in at the Sovereign. I dialed Silas. He answered immediately, anticipating the call. "Did you see the final pages?" he asked, his tone serious and low. "I saw them," I replied, my voice steady and ice-cold. "They forged my signature on federal tax documents, Silas. They tied my name to Julian's offshore accounts. It is federal fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. We have the digital footprint proving the IP addresses originated from Julian's laptop and Vivian's home office. You are completely insulated. But the moment we hand this over to the authorities, they are looking at decades in federal prison." "All of them, good," I said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looking down at the glittering Chicago skyline. "Prepare the evidence binder. Everything goes to the FBI tomorrow morning, but tonight, I want to watch them realize that their designated scapegoat is the one holding the leash." "They are currently experiencing a catastrophic meltdown at the venue," Silas informed me. "The catering company packed up the food when the primary card declined. Julian's guests walked out. Your father has been trying to call the bank for the last 30 minutes. But the accounts do not belong to him anymore." "Let them panic," I said, watching a sleek black car speed down the highway far below. "They will try to find me. They always come crawling back when they run out of options." "I will be at your penthouse in 20 minutes with the security team," Silas stated. "Just in case they get desperate, thank you," I said, and ended the call. I set the phone back down on the marble counter. It immediately lit up with another incoming call. The caller ID flashed Richard. I watched it ring, the glowing screen reflecting off my wine glass, until it went to voicemail. I was no longer the discarded daughter hustling in the mud. I was the architect of their destruction, and I had all the time in the world. The phone screen went dark, only to instantly light up again. This time, the caller ID displayed Chloe, then Julian, then Vivian. A relentless, frantic digital barrage began. The silent notification counter on my screen ticked upward with satisfying speed. 10 missed calls, 30 missed calls, 67 missed calls. The text messages began flooding in. A chaotic mix of confusion, entitlement, and mounting terror. "Elena, why is the general manager saying you own the trust?" "Pick up the phone right now," Chloe demanded in a rapid-fire text. "The corporate cards are declining," Julian wrote moments later. "My investors are walking out of the ballroom. What did you do to the accounts?" Then came a message from Vivian. Her usual venom completely replaced by naked desperation. "Elena, please pick up. The caterings is packing up the food. Everyone is staring at us. Help us." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. The vintage was bold, rich, and tasted like absolute victory. I set my phone face down on the marble island and turned my attention back to my laptop. Through the encrypted security feeds routed directly to my network, I watched the live implosion of their fragile empire. The grand ballroom of the Sovereign Hotel was in total disarray. The jazz band had abruptly stopped playing, leaving an awkward, echoing silence across the room. The opulent buffet stations were being actively dismantled by the catering staff, who were carting away silver trays of lobster and caviar right in front of the bewildered guests. At the center of the room, Vivian was surrounded by a growing crowd of murmuring socialites. Her emerald gown suddenly looked cheap, her diamond necklace heavy like an iron chain. The hotel's general manager stood firmly before her, flanked by the very same security guards she had unleashed on me just an hour ago. I watched Julian, his face flushed and slick with sweat, aggressively jabbing his finger at a declining credit card terminal. The Wall Street investors he had been so desperate to impress were already walking toward the exit, shaking their heads in visible disgust. Chloe was hyperventilating, frantically scrolling through her phone and desperately trying to hide behind her father. And Richard, the man who had offered me a few crumpled $100 bills in the foyer to disappear, was currently pleading with a hotel executive. He looked smaller and more pathetic than I had ever seen him. The illusion was shattered completely. The entire city of Chicago was watching them drown in real time. The private elevator leading directly to my penthouse chimed softly, breaking my focus from the security feeds. The heavy steel doors parted, and Silas stepped out into my foyer, a thick manila folder tucked securely under his arm. He was flanked by two elite security guards, professionals who did not flinch or speak unless spoken to. "The federal authorities have the routing numbers," Silas said, walking over to the kitchen island and setting the folder down. "The Wire Fraud Task Force has already flagged the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They are freezing Julian's remaining assets as we speak. The credit line is locked down, they have absolutely nothing left, and the hotel." I asked, crossing my arms. The manager handed them the bill for the gala. Silas confirmed with a sharp nod. $250,000. When all their corporate cards declined, he gave them exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises before he calls the local authorities for theft of services. The word is already spreading through the charity board. Vivian's reputation is completely dust. I nodded, adjusting the cuffs of my simple black blazer. The same jacket they claimed was not good enough for their tax bracket. "Are they on their way up here?" I asked. Silas checked his encrypted smartwatch. They bypassed the lobby security by tailgating a resident into the parking garage. "They are currently in the freight elevator, heading up to this floor. They should be at your door in exactly 2 minutes." I took a deep breath, the cold clarity of the moment washing over me. I had spent my entire life being pushed aside, minimized, and treated as an inconvenient secret. They had stolen my biological mother's legacy to fund their vanity, and then tried to frame me for federal embezzlement to cover their own spectacular incompetence. Tonight was the end of the line. The heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed through the quiet expanse of my penthouse. It was not a polite knock, it was the desperate, frantic hammering of people who had just realized they were standing on a trap door, and someone had just pulled the lever. "Elena, open the door." Richard's voice was muffled through the thick mahogany, completely stripped of its usual arrogant authority. "Let us in, you have to let us in right now." "Elena, please," Vivian cried out, her voice shrill, unhinged, and echoing down the private corridor. I nodded to the two security guards standing by Silas. They positioned themselves on either side of the entryway, their stances wide and imposing. Silas stood just behind me, a silent, lethal presence, armed with indisputable evidence that would end multiple careers tonight. I walked slowly toward the door. I did not rush. I let them pound against the wood for a few more seconds, letting the harsh, icy reality of their utter helplessness truly sink in. Then, with a smooth, effortless motion, I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the double mahogany doors open. Richard practically fell forward into the entryway. His expensive tuxedo was disheveled, his bow tie undone, his breathing ragged and shallow. Vivian was right behind him, her flawless makeup ruined as black mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. Chloe looked terrified, clutching her designer purse like a shield to her chest, while Julian remained near the back of the group. His eyes darted nervously toward the armed guards flanking my doorway, taking in the reality of the security perimeter. "Elena," Richard gasped, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. Thank God, I did not move an inch, and my expression remained completely stoic. He quickly dropped his hand, unsettled by the coldness in my eyes. "There has been a massive mistake at the hotel," Richard stammered, trying to catch his breath. "The manager is claiming that a blind trust revoked our sponsorship. They froze all of Vivian's charity accounts. The bank is saying, you are the trustee. You have to call them and clear this up right now. Tell them it is a system error. There is no mistake, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through their panic like a freshly sharpened blade. "I own the Sovereign Hotel. I own the land it sits on. I bought your bankrupt estate 3 years ago, when you were too busy bleeding your finances dry to maintain your fake image. The trust belongs to me, and I am the one who froze the accounts." Vivian let out a choked gasp, stepping forward. You? You did this to us? You ruined my gala?" "Elena, we are family. You cannot just cut us off. People are laughing at us downstairs. My reputation is ruined. Your reputation was built on stolen money, Vivian, I replied coldly. You drained my college fund to buy Chloe a sports car. You told me to hustle in the mud, so I did exactly that. I built an empire in the mud while you built a fragile house of cards. And now the wind is blowing. Julian tried to puff out his chest, stepping past Chloe with a faux aggressive glare, reverting to the only strategy he knew: intimidation. Listen to me, you little freelance nobody. You are going to unlock those accounts right now, or I am going to sue you for everything you are worth. You cannot just hijack a federally recognized charity and freeze its assets. I did not even look at him. I simply nodded to Silas. My attorney stepped forward, his presence commanding absolute silence. He dropped the thick, heavy manila folder directly onto the hardwood floor at Julian's feet. The papers spilled out across the marble, exposing bank statements, offshore routing numbers, and falsified tax declarations for anyone to see. Vanguard Holdings, Silas said, his voice deep and resonant. A Cayman Islands shell corporation, $3 million actively diverted from the charity into your personal offshore accounts to cover catastrophic market losses. And to make matters exponentially worse, you and Vivian forged Elena's signature as the chief operations officer to make her the legal fall guy for your embezzlement. Julian's face drained of all color. He looked at the papers scattered on the floor, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The arrogant finance bro had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified, cornered criminal who realized he had just walked directly into a steel trap. You tried to send me to federal prison so you could maintain your luxury lifestyle, I said, finally locking eyes with Julian. The silence in the entryway was suffocating. The FBI already has this entire folder. Julian, they have your routing numbers, and they are currently reviewing the forged signatures. You are not going to sue me. You are going to federal prison. Chloe let out a piercing scream, grabbing Julian's arm and shaking him. Is this true? Tell me this is not true. Julian, he did not answer her. He just stared at the floor, visibly shaking. Richard dropped to his knees right there in my entryway. The proud patriarch, the man who had patronized me and dismissed me my entire life, was now weeping openly at my feet. Elena, please, he begged, his hands clasped together in a desperate plea. I am your father. I did not know about the forgery. I swear on my life I did not know. Do not do this to us. You are going to leave us with nothing. We will be homeless, please. I looked down at the man who had watched security guards grab my arms just hours prior. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the profound, liberating weight of justice. You threw me out tonight because I did not fit your aesthetic, I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. Now, you do not fit my tax bracket. The credit line is permanently frozen. The authorities have the evidence. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my properties before I have you officially evicted. Elena, please, we have nowhere to go. Vivian sobbed, reaching out toward my dress. I took a deliberate step back out of her reach. I looked my father dead in the eye, offering him the exact same coldness he had given me in the hotel foyer. Security, I commanded, echoing the very words that started this entire night. Escort them out. The two guards stepped forward immediately, placing firm, unyielding hands on Richard and Julian. The family that had treated me like dirt for 17 years was forcibly turned around and marched back toward the freight elevator. I did not wait to watch them leave. I reached out and pulled the heavy mahogany doors shut. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying definitive snaps, leaving me in absolute, wealthy peace. Justice is rarely swift, but when it is meticulously planned, it is incredibly thorough. By the following Tuesday, the FBI raided the offices of the Charity Foundation. The footage of Julian, being escorted out of a downtown high-rise in handcuffs, made the evening news. The anchor detailed the massive scope of the offshore wire fraud, completely destroying any lingering shred of Vivian's social standing. Richard tried to file for a protective injunction against my eviction notice, arguing that as my father, he had a right to the estate. The judge threw the case out within 10 minutes, citing the overwhelming evidence of financial misconduct and the clear, legal transfer of the deed 3 years prior. They were forced to pack whatever they could carry into a rented moving truck and drive away from the mansion I now legally owned. Silence is often mistaken for submission. People like Vivian and Julian assume that if you do not react to their insults, you must be weak. They believe that volume equates to power, but true power does not need to announce itself. True power sits quietly in the corner of the room, analyzing the structural integrity of the floorboards they are standing on, and waiting for the perfect moment to pull the lever. I never raised my voice, I never threw a tantrum, I simply went to work. I built my empire in the mud they threw me into. And when I was ready, I used it to bury them. But the eviction was merely the opening act of their destruction. The real devastation, the kind that permanently alters the trajectory of a bloodline, was waiting for them in federal court. 72 hours after I closed my penthouse doors on them, the FBI executed a massive, highly coordinated raid on the Charity Foundation's headquarters. It was not a quiet, discreet operation designed to protect their elite sensibilities. It was a spectacular, very public display of federal force. I watched the live broadcast from the massive flat-screen television in my living room, sipping a fresh cup of espresso. A dozen agents in tactical gear swarmed the downtown high-rise. They carried out dozens of boxes filled with hard drives, physical ledgers, and encrypted servers. Julian was escorted out of the building first. He was in handcuffs, his expensive custom suit rumpled, his arrogant face pale and slick, with the terrifying sweat of a man who realized his entire existence was a fraud. The news cameras flashed aggressively, capturing every single humiliating second of his perp walk. The anchor detailed the massive scope of the offshore wire fraud, completely destroying any lingering shred of Vivian's carefully curated social standing. Her name was entirely mud in Chicago's high society. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. I did not have to look at the caller ID to know who was frantically trying to reach me. It was Chloe. I answered it, placing the phone on speaker as I watched Julian get shoved into the back of a federal vehicle on the television. "Alina, you have to help us," Chloe screamed into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of the mocking entitlement she had wielded against me just days prior. "The FBI just arrested Julian. They froze all our personal accounts. I tried to buy a coffee this morning, and my platinum card was declined. You have to wire me bail money." "Please, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sisterly warmth. "Why would you call the struggling freelance consultant for bail money? I thought I was just a massive embarrassment who was ruining your night." "I did not mean that, I was just stressed." "Please, Elena, you are the only one with liquid capital right now. Julian's bail is set at $5 million, Vivian is having a nervous breakdown, and Dad will not answer his phone. You have to save us." "I am not a bank, Chloe," I replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of my espresso. "And even if I was, you and your husband are a terrible investment. Consider this a lesson in financial independence. It builds character to hustle in the mud." I hung up the phone before she could utter another desperate word and permanently blocked her number. The ensuing legal battle was an absolute bloodbath, but not between the government and my family. The true massacre occurred within the family itself. When faced with the terrifying reality of federal prison, the fragile, toxic bonds that held Richard, Vivian, and Julian together dissolved instantly. They did not unite to fight the charges, they viciously turned on each other in a desperate scramble for immunity. 2 months later, I sat in the polished, wood-paneled gallery of the federal courthouse. I was not there as a grieving daughter or a victim. I was there as the primary forensic auditor, who had supplied the prosecution with the irrefutable evidence of their crimes. Silas sat perfectly still beside me, a silent guardian in a sharp navy suit. We watched as the deposition videos were played for the judge. The facade of the wealthy, loyal family was completely eviscerated for the public record. On the massive digital monitors in the courtroom, Julian's recorded testimony played first. He looked entirely broken, his arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the desperate pleading of a coward trying to save his own skin. "I did not orchestrate the transfers," Julian stammered on the recording, sweating profusely under the harsh lights of the interrogation room. "It was Vivian, she forced me to do it. She told me if I did not help her funnel the money offshore, she would convince Richard to cut me out of the will. She wanted the money hidden, so Richard could not touch it in the divorce settlement. I was just following her aggressive orders." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom gallery. I glanced over at the defense table. Richard slowly turned his head to look at Vivian, his face contorted in a mixture of profound shock and deep, visceral rage. A divorce settlement? She had been actively planning to leave him while simultaneously draining his business partner's charity. Vivian did not look at Richard. She kept her eyes glued to the defense table, her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might shatter. Her own testimony was played next, and she was equally ruthless. "Julian is a pathological liar," Vivian's voice echoed through the courtroom, cold and desperate. "He lost millions in catastrophic crypto investments, and begged me to help him cover it up. He told me he would frame Richard for the fraud if I did not sign the authorization forms. Richard was the one who originally set up the shell companies years ago to avoid corporate taxes. I was a victim of their financial abuse. They were tearing each other apart, desperately throwing their own blood under the bus to shave a few years off their impending sentences. The prosecution did not even need to work hard to secure the convictions. My family was actively handing the government everything they needed. When it was my turn to take the stand, the courtroom fell entirely silent. I walked confidently past the defense table. I did not look at my father. I did not look at my stepmother. I took my seat in the witness box, swearing to tell the absolute truth. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp, older woman with piercing blue eyes, approached the podium. "Vance, can you please explain your relationship to the defendants?" "They are my father, my stepmother, and my brother-in-law," I answered, my voice clear and perfectly level, carrying across the silent courtroom. "And can you explain your role in uncovering the Vanguard Holdings embezzlement scheme?" "I am a senior forensic auditor," I stated, looking directly at the judge. "I purchased the debts of my father's bankrupt estate 3 years ago through a blind trust. During a routine audit of the assets, I discovered a highly coordinated effort to siphon charitable donations into a Cayman Islands shell company. Furthermore, I discovered that the defendants had forged my signature on federal tax documents in a deliberate attempt to frame me as the sole architect of the fraud." The prosecuting attorney nodded slowly. Vance, did the defendants know you were the owner of the trust?" "No," I replied smoothly. "They believed I was a struggling freelance consultant. They believed I was entirely powerless, which is precisely why they chose me to be their designated scapegoat." I finally allowed my gaze to drift toward the defense table. Richard was staring at me, his eyes hollow and defeated. The arrogant patriarch who had told me to hustle in the mud was now sitting in the dirt, entirely destroyed by the daughter he had aggressively discarded. Vivian refused to look at me, her head bowed in absolute humiliation. Julian was actively crying, his face buried in his hands. The judge's final ruling was swift and entirely merciless. Julian was sentenced to 15 years in prison for racketeering, wire fraud, and identity theft. Vivian received 12 years for her active role in the embezzlement and forgery. Richard, while not directly involved in the Vanguard Holdings transfers, was found guilty of massive tax evasion and corporate negligence. He was sentenced to 7 years and stripped of every single remaining asset he possessed to pay restitution. As the bailiffs moved in to heavily handcuff my family and lead them away, Richard stopped right in front of the gallery barrier where I was sitting. "Elena," he whispered, his voice cracking with the heavy weight of his absolute ruin. "I am sorry, please, I am so sorry." I looked at him. I did not feel a massive surge of triumph. I did not feel the need to scream or mock him. I simply felt the profound peaceful silence of a closed chapter. "I know you are, Richard," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. "But apologies do not balance the ledger." I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I turned my back on my father for the final time, and walked out of the courtroom, my head held high, my posture unbroken. I walked out into the crisp, bright Chicago afternoon, completely unburdened by the weight of their toxic expectations. 6 months after the trial concluded, and the heavy cell doors locked firmly behind my family, I stood in the exact same ballroom of the Sovereign Hotel, where Vivian had ordered security to throw me out. The space was entirely unrecognizable. I had spent $3 million gutting the dated, oppressive aesthetic that Richard and Vivian had clung to. The heavy gold leaf accents and suffocating emerald velvet drapes were gone, replaced by sleek, modern architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows, and minimalist luxury that actually belonged in this century. I had completely rebranded the hotel, elevating it from a fading monument of old money into the most exclusive, highly profitable boutique hospitality venue in the Midwest. Tonight was the grand reopening gala, and this time, the guest list was meticulously curated by me. There were no fake billionaires, no desperate socialites clinging to relevance, and absolutely no tolerance for toxic entitlement. I stood near the massive, newly installed glass waterfall near the back of the room, sipping a glass of sparkling water, simply observing the success of my empire. At 32 years old, I was no longer the invisible, discarded daughter playing a role. I was the architect of my own reality. I wore a custom-tailored white silk suit, a stark and deliberate contrast to the simple black dress they had mocked me for wearing a year prior. The live string quartet played a modern, elegant arrangement in the corner. The atmosphere was light, vibrant, and undeniably powerful. Silas stood beside me, reviewing the quarterly revenue projections on his tablet. The hotel was fully booked for the next 2 years, and the profit margins were staggering. "The mayor just arrived," Silas murmured, glancing toward the grand entrance. "And the CEO of Vanguard Innovations is waiting for you in the VIP lounge to discuss the acquisition." "Thank you, Silas," I replied smoothly. "I will be there in 5 minutes." As Silas walked away to greet our high-profile guests, I noticed a woman lingering near the edge of the velvet rope by the entrance. She looked incredibly familiar. It took me a moment to place her face beneath the heavy contouring and the desperate, wide-eyed expression. It was Beatrice, one of Vivian's closest friends, a woman who had stood right beside Vivian at the previous gala, laughing into her champagne glass as security guards grabbed my arms. Beatrice caught my eye and immediately began waving frantically, trying to bypass the head of security. Elena, darling, it is Beatrice." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water and nodded to the head of security, signaling him to let her approach. Beatrice practically sprinted across the marble floor, her high heels clicking anxiously. She looked entirely out of place in her dated, flashy gown, a relic of a social circle that had completely collapsed the moment Vivian was indicted. "Elena, you look absolutely stunning," Beatrice gushed, her voice dripping with fake, sycophantic warmth. "I have been trying to reach your office for weeks." "The reopening is magnificent, simply breathtaking. What do you want, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft and perfectly level. I did not offer her a smile. I did not even offer her a handshake. Beatrice flinched slightly, her fake smile faltering under my cold, clinical gaze. "Well, darling, as you know, my husband's real estate firm is going through a tiny bit of a rough patch. With Vivian away, our social standing took an unfair hit. We were hoping you might consider allowing us to host our annual charity brunch here at the Sovereign. For old time's sake, we would of course need the venue comped, just like Richard used to do for us." I stared at her. The sheer, massive audacity of these people never ceased to amaze me. They had spent 17 years actively participating in my humiliation, completely validating Vivian's abuse, and now they were standing in my building, begging for a handout, because their toxic ringleader was sitting in a federal penitentiary. For old time's sake, I repeated slowly, the words hanging heavily in the crisp, conditioned air of the ballroom. Exactly, Beatrice nodded eagerly, completely misreading my tone. We have always supported your family, Elena. We are your people. You supported a delusion. Beatrice, I corrected her sharply. You supported a criminal enterprise built on stolen money and fake prestige. You stood exactly 10 feet away from me in this very room, while Vivian ordered security to throw me out. And you laughed. Beatrice's face drained of all color. Elena, I did not mean, this is not a soup kitchen for you to network at. Beatrice, I said, intentionally echoing the exact words Vivian had used to humiliate me. I do not comp venues for people who enabled my abuse. And I certainly do not associate with the pathetic remnants of Vivian's collapsed social circle. You cannot speak to me like that. Beatrice hissed, her true, entitled nature finally breaking through the desperate facade. I am a founding member of the Chicago Heritage Board. You need people like me to maintain the prestige of this hotel. I own the hotel, Beatrice, I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I own the prestige, and you are trespassing. I did not have to snap my fingers, I did not have to raise my voice. The head of security, Marcus, the same young man who had managed the valet stand a year ago, and who I had since promoted, stepped smoothly out of the shadows and flanked Beatrice. Ma'am, it is time to leave, Marcus said firmly. Beatrice looked at Marcus, then back at me, her mouth opening and closing in absolute, terrified shock. She realized in that exact moment that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. The era of the fake elite was over, my era had begun. She turned on her heel and practically ran out of the ballroom, her face flushed with deep public humiliation. I watched her leave, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. The last ghost of my past had been officially exorcised from my empire. Silence is often mistaken for submission. People like Vivian, Julian, and Beatrice assume that if you do not actively react to their insults, you must be incredibly weak. They truly believe that volume equates to power. But true power does not need to aggressively announce itself. True power sits quietly in the corner of the room, analyzing the structural integrity of the floorboards they are standing on, and waiting for the perfect moment to pull the lever. I never raised my voice. I never threw a tantrum. I simply went to work. I built my empire in the mud they aggressively threw me into. And when I was perfectly ready, I used it to bury them. For anyone listening to this, who is currently dealing with a toxic family that minimizes your achievements, or tries to use you as their designated scapegoat, remember this: you do not owe them your success. You do not owe them your loyalty, and you certainly do not owe them your peace. Let them underestimate you. Let them laugh. Take all of that anger, all of that deep resentment, and use it as fuel to build your own castle. And when the time comes, do not just lock the doors. Buy the entire kingdom and send them the eviction notice. Thank you for listening. Stay strong, keep building your empires in absolute silence. And I will see you in the next story.